Now listen, son. The guys who come through that door, they're not buying a $90 tool belt. This is a nice hobby. I mean that. I'm glad you've got something to do. Gene Sievert slid the belt back across the counter, and he was still laughing when the boy picked it up. Elias Boone was 18. He'd made that belt out of garbage. 300 pounds of scrap leather a tannery dumped in his barn every 6 weeks, for free, because burying it cost them $8,000 a year. He looked at Sievert and asked one question. How much do they spend on 2 belts over 10 years? 9 years later, that man was selling Elias's belts himself at $340 each. So what did he see in that pile that nobody else did? Let me tell you about Elias Boone, because you need to understand the boy before you can understand what he built. He was born in June of 1991, and by the spring of 2009, he was 17 years old and living with his grandfather on 160 acres on the flat edge of Stafford County, Kansas. That land was not a farm. It was a piece of evidence. A man named Ezra Boone had walked north out of Tennessee in 1878, in the years when thousands of black families who had just come out of slavery packed what they could carry and moved west toward Kansas looking for ground that belonged to them. They called those people exodusters. Most of the county had forgotten the word. Ezra Boone got as far as the flat country west of Wichita, stopped, and built a house with his own hands. And that house was still standing. Otis Boone was born in it in 1938, which made him 71 the spring the truck came. He rose at 4:30. He ate the same breakfast. He drove the same county roads. He farmed wheat on the same ground his grandfather had broken and kept a small herd of Angus. And he did both things the way his father had done them, which was the way his father's father had done them before that. He was not a man who doubted the value of continuity. And here is the part almost everybody misses, and that Gene Sievert would never once consider. For a Boone, continuity was the victory. For 100 years, everything around that farm had wanted the Boones gone. Staying was not inertia. Staying was the whole war, won slowly, by a man who never raised his voice about it. Elias's grandmother died in 2004. His parents worked in Wichita, his father at a plant and his mother in a hospital, and they were raising his little sister Naomi, who was small enough then that the farm was just the place you went at Christmas. When Elias was 12, he asked to stay out there with his grandfather instead of going back to the city. Nobody made him. He chose that gravel, that house, that man. It is worth remembering later when people start explaining what he came from. He was not a rebellious kid. He was a curious one, which is a different thing entirely. He fed cattle. He learned to drive a tractor before most of his classmates had learned to ride a bicycle. He spent Saturday afternoons in the barn with a flashlight and a wrench, taking things apart that did not need taking apart just to see how they fit together. He pulled the hydraulic pump off his grandfather's baler twice before he was 13. The second time, he found a crack in the housing that nobody had noticed and fixed it before it could fail out in the field. Otis Boone looked at that repair for a long while without saying anything. Good eye. In the Boone house, that was the highest praise available. Now let me tell you about the sentence that started all of it, because it did not come from a business school. It came from a high school agriculture classroom in St. John, Kansas, in the fall of 2008 from a teacher named Anita Zondergaard, who opened a unit on material life cycles by telling a room full of seniors something that none of them wrote down except one. The most undervalued resource in American agriculture is not land. It is not water. It is not labor. It is waste. Not what you grow, what you throw away. Elias Boone copied it into the margin of his school notebook and underlined it twice. He was 17 and had no plan for it. He just knew it was true, the way you know a bolt is stripped before you get the wrench on it. Ray Petrosky is the reason he knew what a tool belt was supposed to do. Ray ran a mechanic shop in Pratt. He was 54 years old, and his shop floor was so clean you could see the ceiling lights in it. Elias had been sweeping that floor since he was 14, $40 for a Saturday, and Ray had been talking at him the entire time. Ray understood the thing that hardly anyone understands, which is that the difference between a good tool and a bad tool is not price, it is design. He had opinions about leather, he had opinions about stitching, he had opinions about what a work belt had to do and about how most work belts failed to do it. And he said those things to the kid pushing the broom in the specific way a man talks to somebody he suspects will eventually do something about it. Elias listened. He always listened. Understand what was happening around all of this. Through the 2000s, the economics of small family farms across the Great Plains were being quietly compressed. Price swings, input costs climbing every year, margins thinning on every operation in the county. Otis Boone did not talk about it. He did the arithmetic at the kitchen table in the evenings, and the arithmetic got a little worse each time. And then there was the Tannery, which is the other half of this story, and which most people who know the Boone name have never heard about at all. The Stafford County Leather Works had been running since 1961. It took hides from regional feedlots and turned them into leather for industrial customers. Equipment belts, drive straps, heavy aprons for meatpacking plants. By the middle of the decade, it employed 47 people and processed roughly 4,000 hides a year. It smelled the way tanneries smell, which is a smell you either learn to ignore or you move away from. Most of the county had learned to ignore it, and it produced a great deal of waste leather. Irregular cuts, edge pieces, everything trimmed off before the good rectangles went out the door. Here is the hinge the entire story turns on. That waste was not useless. It was inconvenient. Too small for drive belts, too irregular for aprons, too varied in thickness to run efficiently through industrial machinery. So the tannery trucked it to a landfill over in Reno County and paid roughly $8,000 a year for the privilege of burying it. Nobody in Stafford County thought about that leather at all. Not the tannery, not the feed store crowd, not the Farm Bureau, not the man at the Agra Valley Co-op who would spend years explaining patiently and without malice exactly why it could never amount to anything. It was not a gift, it was cost-cutting. In late 2008, a man named Dale Crowley, who managed operations at the tannery, sat down with the disposal invoices and decided the landfill made no sense. Farmers had big properties. Farmers had no objection to free material. So he started calling them. He did not divert all of it. He diverted what fit on a truck run he was already making, 300 pounds, every 6 or 8 weeks, whatever was stacked by the door when the driver left. The rest still went in the ground. That detail will matter enormously later, and nobody noticed it for 9 years. No payment, no contract, just a phone call and a truck. Several farmers said yes. Otis Boone said yes because free material is free material, and he figured he could use scrap leather for something around the barn. He mentioned it over breakfast that winter. Elias set down his fork and asked 2 questions. How much? How often? His grandfather told him a few hundred pounds every 6 or 8 weeks whenever they had a load. Elias picked his fork back up, finished his eggs, and did not say another word for the rest of the meal. But he was thinking. The truck came on a Tuesday morning in March of 2009, a little after 9 o'clock, and nothing about it looked like a beginning. The driver did not knock. He did not leave a note. He backed along the gravel beside the barn, pulled the lever, and 300 pounds of mixed scrap slid out and settled into the dust, like something the world had decided it no longer needed. Then he drove away. Elias Boone was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching it. He was 17 years old, 2 months from finishing high school. He stood there for a long moment. Then he set down the cup and walked outside. He spent 2 hours in that pile, not looking at it, sorting it. He worked with his bare hands, pulling pieces free and laying them out on the gravel in rows, by thickness, by surface quality, by moisture, by what he could see and feel about the grain structure of each piece. He did not know what he was doing. He had no idea that morning that he was running the first crude version of a system that would still be operating 14 years later with a dozen people trained on it. He knew one thing, and it was the only thing that separated him from every other farm in the county getting the same free delivery. Nobody else was doing this. The other farmers took their loads too. The leather sat where the trucks left it. It got rained on. Some of it got used for gate hinges, some of it got burned, and most of it just went gray in the weather and became one more pile of nothing behind one more barn. Which is the part people cannot ever quite accept, because the story sounds like luck. A truck showed up. Free material. Anyone could have done it. Anyone did have it. Free. Delivered. Every 6 to 8 weeks to 4 farms in Stafford County. One person sat down in it. By noon, he had that pile broken into 6 rows, and he stood up and looked at what he had made. And what he saw was not garbage anymore. It was an inventory. Somebody had thrown away an inventory and was paying $8,000 a year to keep throwing it away, and a 17-year-old with dirt on his knees was standing in the middle of it doing arithmetic. He went inside. He wrote nothing down. Not yet. He had been getting ready for 6 months without knowing what he was getting ready for. He had been reading about leatherwork since the previous fall. 3 books ordered from a supplier in Denver and a 4th from a craft school in Vermont. All 4 paid for with money he earned sweeping Ray Petrosky's floor. He had been studying how work belts were built, how tool holsters carried load, how the professional grade differed from the cheap nylon that had taken over the market in the 1990s. And he had Ray, who one Saturday put down a wrench and handed him the entire market in 4 sentences. Every tradesman I know is one of 2 guys. First guy owns one good belt he bought 15 years ago and he's still wearing it. Second guy owns 4 cheap ones, and every one of them fell apart. There's no guy in the middle. The middle's dead. Now understand where Elias Boone was actually standing that spring. He was a senior. He had 3 roads in front of him, and every adult in his life could see all 3, and every one of them was reasonable. There was a partial scholarship at Kansas State, which was the right road. There was farming with his grandfather, which was the loyal road. There was the plant in Wichita where his father worked, which was the safe road. The scrap pile was not a 4th road. The scrap pile was garbage. Choosing it meant choosing the one thing not a single adult in his life would have recognized as a choice at all. He carried a piece of it into the kitchen that afternoon anyway. A shoulder cut, maybe 14 inches by 9, clean grain on one face, a slight irregularity along one edge that would trim away without costing him anything. He put it on the table and looked at it for a while. Then he went out to the barn and got his grandfather's old saddle stitching awl. Let me stop here and ask you something. How many times have you looked at something everyone else was throwing away and wondered whether they were wrong? And how many times did you have that thought and then let it go? Because the distance between the thought and the action looked too wide to cross. You are 17. Nobody gave you permission. Nobody funded you. Nobody believed you. Elias Boone was not a person who let that distance stop him. He was the person who went and got the awl. The first belt took him 11 days. He worked evenings after the chores were done and weekend mornings before the day's work started. He had no pattern, so he drafted one on brown paper off measurements taken from Ray's old belt and from 3 others he bought second-hand at a farm auction in Pratt for a few dollars apiece. He cut the pieces with a rotary cutter and a steel straight edge. He punched every hole by hand, and he stitched it with waxed linen thread using a 2-needle saddle stitch he taught himself out of a book, which is a stitch that locks itself, so that, if one section fails, the rest holds. The hardware was brass, rivets, D-rings, and a roller buckle ordered from a harness supplier in Hutchinson. The finished belt weighed just under 2 pounds. 4 tool loops, a hammer loop, 2 open pockets, and a main pouch with a snap closure. It was not beautiful. The stitching ran uneven in 2 places. One pocket sat a 1/4 inch lower than he had intended. But it was solid. It was the kind of solid you feel when you pick something up and your hands tell you, before your brain does, that this thing is not going to fail. He gave it to Ray Petrosky. Ray wore it a week and said nothing about it at all. Then on a Friday evening, he came out of the shop, set it on the counter, and delivered the review. Pocket needs to come up half an inch. Hammer loop needs reinforcing at the base. Other than that, it's the best belt I've ever worn in my life. Elias wrote both things down. That is the moment the notebook starts. Not the school one with the teacher's sentence in the margin, a plain spiral notebook off the rack at the drugstore in St. John, $1 and change. And from that Friday forward, everything went into it. Every correction, every price, every number, every word anybody ever said to him about the work, good or bad, copied down exactly the way it left their mouth. Because here is what he had figured out at 17, and it takes most men 60 years, and some of them never get there. Feelings are not evidence. Feelings evaporate. A man can laugh at you and you can burn about it for a week, and at the end of the week, you have nothing. But if you write down what he said word for word with the date beside it, then it stops being an insult. It becomes data. He made the second belt the following week. The pocket sat half an inch higher. The hammer loop was reinforced at the base. Out on the gravel at 3 other farms in Stafford County, the leather was going gray in the weather. And in 6 weeks, another truck was coming. Messenger. Let me tell you about the morning at the Agra Valley Co-op, because that is where the story took its first public turn, and it turned on a laugh. The co-op was a low building with a concrete floor and a counter worn smooth by 40 years of elbows, and it was where the important conversations in Stafford County happened before they happened anywhere else. Gene Sievert had been selling seed and chemicals and equipment parts across it since 1987. He was not a cruel man. He was a certain man, which in some ways is harder to argue with than cruelty. He had served that community long enough to have developed a comprehensive theory of what worked and what did not. And his theory did not include an 18-year-old black kid making tool belts out of tannery garbage in a barn on the piece of ground everybody in the county still called the Boone Place. By April of 2010, Elias had been selling about 6 months. He had started with tradesmen coming through Ray's shop in Pratt, then a few contractors in Hutchinson, then a hardware store in St. John that took 6 belts on consignment. He was asking $85, which was 40 more than the nylon belt at the farm supply and 40 less than the branded leather ones. He was making about 12 a month, which was everything he could manage around the farm work. He walked in with 2 samples in a canvas bag and set them on the counter. Gene Sievert picked one up. He turned it over. He looked at the stitching. He pressed his thumb into the leather and set it back down. Then he looked at the price tag, which said $90. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has watched a great many things not work out and has developed a reflex for spotting the next one. It was the laugh of institutional confidence. The sound of a man who knows the market, knows the customer, knows the county, and cannot quite believe somebody is standing in front of him with a canvas bag full of handmade leather belts priced at $90 apiece. When he could talk again, his voice had the particular gentleness of a man explaining something to a child. Now listen, son. The guys who come through that door, they're not buying $90 tool belts. They're buying the $30 belt at Tractor Supply, and they're replacing it every couple years, and they're fine with that. He pushed the belt back across the counter. This is a nice hobby, I mean that. I'm glad you've got something to do. Understand what happened in that sentence because it is the whole thing, and it never once gets said out loud in this story. Nobody in that building used an ugly word. Nobody ever would. Gene Sievert would have been genuinely offended if you had told him he had done anything that morning but be kind to a young man. He just said the word son twice to a grown man who had come in to sell him something. And then he said he was glad he had something to do, which is a sentence nobody says to a supplier and everybody says to a kid who needs keeping busy. Elias Boone put both belts back in the canvas bag. He looked at Gene Sievert for a moment. "How much do they spend on 2 belts over 10 years? Sievert blinked. "Because mine last 10. I've got the stitching data to prove it." Gene Sievert smiled the smile of a man who has already made up his mind. "Good luck with it, son." Here is the part almost nobody notices. He was lying. He did not have stitching data. He had a notebook, a hunch, 4 books, and 11 days of work. He said it because it was the only sentence in the room that could not be laughed at, and it came out of his mouth before he had any right to it. He drove home on the county road with the windows down. He did not tell Ray. He did not tell his grandfather. He never told anybody, and Gene Sievert lived out the next 13 years never knowing he had been in that conversation at all. Elias sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook and wrote 3 lines. The first said, "Stitching durability data. Need formal test results." And underneath, in smaller handwriting, "I lied. I don't have it. Get it." The second said, "Price resistance at $90. Test 110 with premium positioning." The third said, "Gene Sievert said no. Come back in 2 years." Then he closed it and went out to do the evening chores. That is the moment to understand him, if you are ever going to. A man had just laughed at him across a counter, and his response was not anger, and it was not humiliation. It was a homework assignment. He had told a lie in public. He had 24 weeks of work ahead of him turning it into the truth. Grammar. He did not go to Kansas State that fall. The partial scholarship went unused. He stayed on the farm. But in September, he enrolled in night classes in material science at Barton Community College, 70 miles each way, 2 evenings a week, and he drove it in the dark both directions with the notebook on the passenger seat. He was not doing it for a degree. He wrote the reason down, and the sentence is worth reading twice. "I don't need a credential. I need vocabulary. They won't believe the belt. They'll believe the chart." Now let me tell you about the science, because the science is the part everyone who laughed never bothered to understand. The standard tool belt sold through farm supply and hardware chains was made from split leather. Split leather is the lower layer of a hide, what remains after the top grain has been shaved off for premium goods. It is cheaper to produce and easier to run through machinery, but it has a structural problem that no amount of manufacturing can fix. The grain layer, the outermost surface where the fiber structure is tightly interlocked, where leather actually gets its strength, is gone. What is left is looser and more porous. It drinks moisture. It stretches under load. It breaks down at stress points substantially faster. A split leather belt in daily use, carrying 8 to 12 pounds of tools, flexing several hundred times a day at the same 3 or 4 points, begins to fail at the punch holes and the stitch lines within 18 to 24 months. That is not a defect. That is a predictable material outcome. And the leather the Stafford County Leather Works was dumping on Boone Gravel was not split leather. It was top grain offcuts from industrial drive belt production. Rejected not for quality, rejected for dimensional irregularity. The grain intact. The fiber density exactly what you find in premium saddlery leather. The only thing wrong with it was that it was the wrong shape, which brought him, in the spring of 2010, to the sentence that turns this entire story. He wrote it in the truck with the engine running. "A tool belt does not require large, continuous pieces of leather. It requires the right thickness in the right place, joined by stitching strong enough to carry load across the seam. A properly tensioned saddle stitch in waxed linen has a tensile strength that exceeds the tear strength of top grain leather at the stitch holes, which means the leather fails before the seam does, which means the limiting factor in how long a belt lives is not the stitching. It is the leather. And his leather was the best money could buy. Except he was not buying it. They were driving it to his house. So he made his lie true. He built 12 identical test panels, 6 from Tannery scrap, 6 cut out of $30 belts he bought at Tractor Supply for exactly that purpose. He hung 15 pounds of dead weight from each one and flexed it through a 90-degree arc 500 times a day, which approximated the load and the movement of a belt on a working man. He photographed every panel weekly and recorded the condition of the stitch holes and the surface grain. At 8 weeks, the commercial panels showed visible fiber separation at the punch holes. At 12 weeks, 3 of the 6 had cracked along the primary flex line. At 24 weeks, all 6 commercial panels had failed. All 6 of his were intact. He had the photographs, he had the notes, he had the dates. He put them in a folder in the kitchen drawer next to the notebook. He had stood at that counter and claimed he had data. It took him 24 weeks to stop lying, and he did not go back to the co-op. Not yet. The economics were simpler than the science. The leather was free. His material cost per belt was hardware, thread, and consumables, brass rivets, roller buckles, D-rings, waxed linen, $9 to $14 depending on configuration. His labor, which he was not paying himself for in any formal sense, ran about 6 hours. He was selling at 90. His gross margin on materials alone was above 80%. The constraint was never profitability. The constraint was time and distribution. So let me tell you about the years between 2010 and 2013, which is the stretch everybody skips, and which is the only reason there is a story at all. He did not quit the farm. He did not borrow money. He did not hire anybody. He worked the ground with his grandfather in daylight, made belts in the evenings, and drove to Barton twice a week in the dark. And he sold through every single channel that did not require Gene Sievert's approval. He sold at farm auctions. He rented a 10-foot table at the county fair for $40, sold 11 belts in 2 days, and came home with $990 and a list of names and phone numbers belonging to people who wanted more. He talked a plumbing supply house in Wichita into a display case by the front counter. A roofing contractor in Pratt bought 6 at once for his crew and called back 3 months later asking where he could get more. He took out a small classified ad in a regional agricultural newspaper, and over a year it produced 47 orders out of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. And Ray Petrosky, quietly and without making any production of it, started telling every tradesman he knew that the kid who used to sweep his floor made the best tool belt they would ever own, and they ought to call him. That accounted for roughly 30% of the orders in 2012. Elias knew the number because he asked every new customer how they had heard of him and wrote the answer down. He also got better. The stitching that ran uneven on the first belt was perfectly consistent by the 50th. And he built the grading system, which would eventually be worth more than any belt he ever made. Every incoming load got sorted and assigned. The heaviest, densest pieces became the main body and the tool pockets. Medium weight became loops and backing panels. The lightest became interior liners and closure flaps. Nothing was wasted. The smallest offcuts, too small for any structural component at all, became key fobs and tool roll straps he sold for $12 a piece at a material cost of essentially zero. In 2011, he sold 240 belts and about 600 small accessories. In 2012, 310 belts and better than 1,000 accessories, for revenue just under $40,000 against $11,000 in hardware and thread. The leather was still free. Ray Petrosky closed his shop in Pratt in 2012. The same economics that had been grinding down every farm in the county had finally gotten around to grinding down a mechanic. He came to work for Elias. He built a proper cutting table. He built a wall rack that held the sorted grades where a man could reach them. He built a small press for setting rivets, faster and more consistent than the hand tool. The man who had once paid a 14-year-old $40 a day to sweep his floor was now drawing a paycheck signed by him. Neither of them ever discussed it. Ray said one thing about it once with the paperwork in front of him. "You priced it right." And he picked up the pen. Which brings us to the spring of 2013, and the evening Otis Boone made his decision. He had been watching from a careful distance for 4 years. He never obstructed anything. He gave up the barn space without being asked, and he never once suggested the leather was a distraction from the wheat. But he was a wheat farmer, and wheat farmers in Stafford County had a particular relationship with the idea of diversification, which was that it was something other people did when they did not know what they were doing. And he was a boon. And for a boon, doing exactly what your father did, on exactly the ground your people walked out of Tennessee to get, was not inertia. It was keeping a promise. He watched the numbers. He watched the barn fill with sorted leather and empty out again as finished belts went out the door. He did not say much, but Elias noticed his grandfather had started reading the order book on the kitchen counter, and that he read it the way he read the commodity price reports, carefully and without expression. One evening after supper, Otis sat down at the kitchen table. "How much space do you need?" Elias looked at him. "If you had more space, would you make more belts?" "Yes, sir." "Old equipment shed's empty. It's yours." Then he stood up, picked up his coffee cup, and walked into the living room. That was the entire conversation. That was Otis Boone saying he had been watching and that he had decided. Elias sat there a while. Then he opened the notebook and wrote, "Equipment shed conversion. Hire first employee. Target 600 belts per year." The Farm Bureau met quarterly at the community center in St. John. The agenda was always longer than the time available, and the real conversations happened in the parking lot afterward. Elias had been going 2 years, partly because his grandfather had always gone, mostly because he had worked out that the Farm Bureau was where the county's informal economic consensus got assembled, and he wanted to understand it. He sat near the back. He listened more than he spoke. He was also, at most of those meetings, the only black man in the room. He never wrote that down. He only wrote down the numbers. Gene Sievert sat on the Agricultural Diversification Committee, which existed to encourage farmers to develop income beyond their primary commodity. That October, he gave a short presentation on small-scale value-added enterprise, and he had a list of examples. He mentioned a woman over in Reno County who made goat cheese. He mentioned a family in Pratt County running a corn maze. He did not mention Elias Boone, who was sitting 12 rows behind him with a notebook in his lap, and who by that point had generated better than $60,000 in revenue from a product made entirely out of material that the county's own largest leather processor was paying to bury. Understand the difference, because it matters more than any insult in this story. That was not an attack. That was an omission. And an omission is worse. Because to insult a man, you first have to see him. Afterward, out in the parking lot where the real business got done, somebody asked Sievert what he made of the Boone belt operation, which by then was something people knew about even if they did not entirely understand it. He answered with the particular confidence of a man who had been right about most things for most of his career. "I think it's a nice little side business. I think the boy's going to hit a wall when he runs out of people who'll pay $100 for a tool belt, and I think he'll go back to farming full-time, and that'll be fine." Then he added the sentence that would be handed back to him, word for word, 2 years later. "The market for handmade goods has a ceiling, always has." 3 people heard it. One repeated it to Elias the following week. He wrote it in the notebook exactly the way he wrote everything else, every word with the date beside it. Then he turned the page and wrote the production targets for 2014. And this is the pattern of the entire man, so watch it closely. He did not get angry. He built infrastructure. Ray spent November and December converting the equipment shed. He insulated it. He wired it for proper lighting. He built a run of workbenches down the south wall and put in ventilation that kept the leather dust manageable. On the north wall, he built the pattern library. Plywood templates for every component of every configuration, hanging on hooks, each one labeled in Elias's handwriting. A drying rack, a staging area for outgoing orders. By January of 2014, the shed was running, and it smelled like leather and sawdust and linseed oil. which is one of the better combinations of smells a working space can have. In February, he hired his first employee. Carla Ramirez was 24. She had grown up on a farm outside Pratt and had a background in leatherwork from her 4-H years that she had never once thought of as professionally relevant until the phone rang. He spent 3 weeks teaching her the saddle stitch, the grading system, the component cutting process, the quality standards he had pulled out of 11 days and a borrowed awl. By the end of March, she was producing belts he could not distinguish from his own by inspection. By the end of April, she was faster than him on the stitching. And that is the moment he understood what he had actually built. The quality was not in his hands. It was in the system, which meant it could be copied, which meant it could grow. The target was 600 belts. They made 712. Revenue was $104,000 against $28,000 in material, and the net margin after Carla's wages and the shed and the hardware ran better than 60%. The leather was still free. By then, Dale Crowley had worked out that the arrangement was saving the tannery about $9,000 a year, and he formalized it with a simple letter of agreement giving Elias right of first refusal on every offcut above a minimum thickness. Elias had signed it in 2012. He was the only person in 4 counties who thought to ask for it. He was 20 years old. And in the notebook that December, under the 712, he wrote a line that nobody paid any attention to at the time, including him. 300 pounds every 7 weeks is about 900 belts a year. We are almost out of leather. Messenger. Now let me tell you about the summer of 2014, because everybody who knows the Boone name remembers the drought, and almost nobody remembers what the drought actually did. It was the driest summer in Stafford County in 11 years. The wheat came in at 40% of normal across the whole county. Otis Boone's ground made 31 bushels to the acre. His average was 78. At the price that summer, that was a shortfall of roughly $38,000 against what he had projected. He was not alone. Farm families all over the county were doing arithmetic with no good answers in it. And every one of them did the same thing because it is the thing the system was built for. They went to the bank. They drew on the operating line. They deferred maintenance. They waited for next year. That is the entire reason a single dry summer does not kill a farm. Otis Boone applied. Otis Boone was denied. Nobody said anything. Nobody did anything you could point at. There was a document missing from the file. There was a longer processing time. There was a lower valuation on the collateral. There was an appointment that got moved twice. And then there was a 1-page letter. Elias read it standing in the kitchen. Then he asked his grandfather whether this was the first time. Otis did not answer for a long while. 4th. 1983. 1996, 2002, 2014. 2002 was the one that mattered, and Elias had never heard about it. That was the year a combine went down in the middle of harvest, and the operating line came back denied, and a 70-year-old man finally did the thing he had spent his whole life refusing to do. He borrowed against the ground itself. Not at the terms his neighbors got, at the terms a man takes when he has no other terms available, from a lender who required a balloon payment down the road and knew exactly what he was requiring it of. Elias Boone, 23 years old, understood something he had lived beside his entire life and had never once seen. His grandfather had never been playing the same game as the neighbors he waved to every morning. That continuity he was so loyal to, that unbroken line back to a man who walked up out of Tennessee, he had been holding it together with his bare hands, while everyone around him was handed tools. And that was when Elias finally understood why his grandfather had never wanted him to try anything new. It was not that Otis did not believe in him. It was that Otis had watched 4 separate times what happens when a Boone asks this system for a chance. Now here is what the drought did to the belts. Nothing. The third quarter of 2014 was the best in the history of the operation. $41,000, July through September. The drought did not affect the tannery. Hides come from feedlots, and feedlots do not care about rain in Stafford County. It did not affect the demand for tool belts among framers in Wichita, or roofers in Denver, or tradesmen in Oklahoma City. It did not touch one single thing Elias Boone was doing, because what he was doing was not wired into the weather the way wheat is wired into the weather. It was wired into the fact that a 17-year-old had looked at garbage and seen an inventory. And this is where the story stops being satisfying and starts being true. In October, the note came due, and the shortfall meant it could not be met, and the bank moved. $57,000. 38 from the dry summer. 19 from a balloon payment written in 2002 by a man who had already been told no 3 times. 160 acres. The ground Ezra Boone walked out of Tennessee to get, held through the Depression, through the Dust Bowl, through every dry year and every quiet door that closed in every bank lobby in central Kansas. Going to auction. And the equipment shed was standing on it. The cutting table Ray built, the pattern library, the grading rack, the exact patch of gravel where a tannery truck had been backing up every 6 to 8 weeks for 5.5 years. All of it. This is the part where Gene Sievert turns out to have been right, for a reason he never once considered. He said there was a ceiling. There was a ceiling. It just was not sitting on top of the market for handmade goods. It was sitting on top of the right to own the ground you are standing on. That evening, Otis sat out on the porch, and when his grandson came out, he did not look up. "Don't you put a dime into this. I've watched this happen to enough men. Land goes, it goes. You've still got the shed." And he stopped. Because they both knew the shed went too. That was the first time in 23 years that Elias Boone heard his grandfather give something up. Not lose it, give it up. There is a difference, and he heard it. The truck was coming in 3 weeks. 300 pounds of the best leather in America. Free, delivered, right on schedule. To a farm that would not be theirs by spring. He opened the notebook and did what he always did. Saving the ground took $57,000. He had $61,000. 5.5 years of evenings. Every belt, every key fob, every 10-foot table at every county fair. If he wrote the check, there was no second press, no new hires, no shipping station, no expansion of any kind. Boone Tool Works stopped exactly where it stood, and it stayed stopped until the money came back. 18 months minimum, in a market that would not wait for him. If he did not write it, the ground went to auction, and the shed went with it, and the truck started delivering to an address that belonged to somebody else. And then he wrote the cruelest sentence in the entire notebook, and underlined it hard enough to tear the page. "I'm going to use the money I made from garbage to save the wheat. I'm going to take the thing that works and pay for the thing that doesn't." Miss Zondergaard said the most undervalued resource is waste. She never said what to do when the thing you can't throw away is the only thing you can't afford to keep. That is the real conflict of this story, and it took 5 years and a drought to get it out into the open. It was never the boy against Gene Sievert. It was never handcraft against industry. It was this. What does the new thing owe the old thing that made it? He answered in cash, but he did not answer with a gift. Understand what he was up against. Otis Boone had been turned down 4 times by men who never used an ugly word, and he had stayed anyway, and the staying was the only thing he had ever asked the world to notice. A man like that does not take charity from his grandson. He would sit on that porch and watch the auction flag go up first, and both of them knew it. So Elias built the way around it, the same way he had built around every piece of leather that came in the wrong shape. He came to the kitchen table with paperwork already drawn. Boone Tool Works would purchase the equipment shed and the 3 acres around it at appraised value. The balance would be advanced to Otis Boone as a term loan at 4%, with a written repayment schedule, signatures, and a notary coming out from St. John on Thursday. Not a gift, a transaction. Otis looked at those pages a long while. His grandson had spent 5 years learning to see value where other men saw trash. He had turned that same eye on his own grandfather, found the one thing standing in the way, and engineered around it. Otis Boone picked up the pen and signed. Then he spoke quietly, the way a man says a thing he has been working towards saying for a while. You were right. Elias was standing at the counter. He did not say anything back. He nodded. What do you need? And here is where this story refuses to be the story you want it to be. Because the honest answer was everything. And the honest answer after that was nothing. For a year and a half. He told him the truth. 2 more people, a second press, a shipping station, and none of it until 2016 at the earliest, because the account had $4,000 in it, and the leather ran out at 900 belts a year no matter how many people he hired. Otis Boone took that in. Then you'll do it in 2016. He stood up and walked outside. The screen door closed. And then there was nothing for a long time, and Elias understood that his grandfather was standing on the porch looking at the dry fields, thinking about what he had said, and finding that it held. 3 weeks later, the truck came through the gate right on schedule and backed up along the gravel and dumped 300 pounds of top grain offcuts beside a shed that now, on paper, filed at the county courthouse, belonged to the boy who had walked out to meet the first load with a cup of coffee going cold on the windowsill behind him. The leather was still free, and it was still 900 belts a year. 2015 was flat, and 2016 was flat, and that is not a failure of the telling. That is what actually happened. He was out of money and out of leather at the same time. He could not hire because there was nothing for anyone to cut. Carla and Ray and Elias made 890 belts in 2015 and about 900 in 2016, which was every square inch the truck brought. So he could not grow on volume, which left exactly one direction. Let me tell you about the Wednesday afternoon in October of 2015 when Gene Sievert drove out to the shed unannounced in his pickup, which is how every serious conversation in Stafford County begins. Carla was at the stitching bench. Ray was on the press. That was the entire company. The shed smelled like leather, and the afternoon light came through the south windows in long, flat rectangles across the benches. Sievert stood in the doorway looking at it. Then he took his cap off. I hear you're doing $1 million. Not close. What are you doing? About 180,000, 3 of us. Sievert put the cap back on. He looked at the pattern library, then the grading rack, then the shelf of finished belts waiting to ship, and the labels, and the handwriting on the labels. I told you it had a ceiling. Elias did not need the notebook. He had known it by heart since 2013. You told me the market for handmade goods has a ceiling, always has. Sievert blinked, and Elias kept going. I didn't build a handmade goods business, Mr. Sievert. I built a manufacturing operation that uses handcraft methods to make a product the market was underserving. There's a difference. I'd like to carry your belts. I know. He walked to the staging area and picked up a folder. It was already sitting there. He had not made it that morning or that week. He had been carrying that folder in his head since April of 2010. Sievert looked at the wholesale sheet. This is your wholesale price? Yes. That's higher than I thought. Yes. I'll take 20 to start. Minimum order is 30. Net 30 terms. I'll need a signed agreement. Sievert took the folder. All right. He did not call him son once in that entire conversation. He drove off down the county road, and Elias watched him go, and then went back inside and told Carla, and Carla laughed, and Elias laughed too. It was the first time he had laughed about Gene Sievert since April of 2010. Then, in the spring of 2016, he found the thing that made the brand. The American tool belt market had 3 floors. On the bottom, synthetic and split leather between $25 and $60 sold through mass chains, replaced every 18 to 30 months. In the middle, 70 to 140, marketed as premium, made of the exact same split leather, priced up with branding and packaging. On top, 150 to 400, sold through specialty dealers, supposedly top grain, supposedly good for decades. Elias had entered in the middle because the middle is where an unknown 18-year-old survives. That spring, he bought the 6 most expensive tool belts in America, $250 to $400 apiece, and cut every one of them in half on Ray's cutting table. 4 of the 6 were split leather, better packaging, a brand story about 4 generations, plated hardware, selling at 3 times his price, built out of material he would not have used for an interior liner. He laid the 12 halves out on the bench and looked at them for a long time. The top of that market was not protected by quality. It was protected by the fact that nobody had ever thought to cut one open. He wrote the line that defines everything that came after. I've been pricing like a challenger. I should be pricing like a man who already won. The leather is free. The knowledge isn't. Price accordingly. So he went up, not with marketing, with the only things he had ever had. Every belt got stamped with a serial number and a year on the inside face. Every belt carried a lifetime warranty, which was not a promotion but an engineering statement. He knew the leather failed before the stitch. He knew his leather did not fail. And he had photographs from 2010 to prove it. Every belt was made to measure. Waist, dominant hand, tool configuration by trade. And the 900 belt ceiling stopped being a problem and started being the product. He published it. He told people exactly how many existed and exactly why there could not be more. Which is the last irony, and it closes the circle back to the gravel. The scarcity of garbage, the very reason it had been thrown away, that it was too small, too irregular, too limited, was the thing that turned Boone Tool Works into a luxury brand. He could not make more. Not being able to make more is the definition of luxury. 900 belts at $210 was $230,000 in 2016. In the spring of 2017, he wrote the checks he had promised himself in 2014. 2 more hires, the second press, a shipping station. 30 months late, exactly as he had told his grandfather it would be. Then the article ran, and the headline mattered more than the story. A writer from a regional business magazine in Wichita spent a day at the farm, and the piece went out as, "From Scrap to Craft, How a Stafford County Farm Boy Built a 6-Figure Tool Belt Business Out of Tannery Waste." Elias called him. "I'm 25 years old. I have 5 employees. I'm 2 classes from a materials science degree. I'm not a farm boy. I'm a manufacturer." The writer apologized. The online headline was corrected. The story itself was good. It covered the material science, the grading system, the tannery relationship, the economics. It was about what he did instead of who he was, which is exactly what he had asked for. A national trade publication for small manufacturers picked it up. That publication was read by a buyer at a regional hardware chain out of Tulsa who had been looking for American-made work gear for a premium section. He called in June. 42 stores across Oklahoma, Kansas, and southern Missouri. 3 SKUs. Minimum 400 units per quarter. Elias did the math in the notebook while the man was still talking. 1,600 belts a year for one account, against a supply that made 900, all of it already spoken for. Taking that order meant buying split leather to cover the gap. It meant becoming the exact thing he had cut in half on Ray's table. "I don't make 400 a quarter." There was silence on the line. "I'm sorry?" "I'll make you 1 SKU, 60 a quarter. Wholesale is 40% above the number you just gave me, and I need them in a locked case, not on a rack. The buyer told him nobody sells tool belts in a locked case. Nobody has yet. Then he asked the question everyone asks. Can you guarantee consistent quality at that volume? Yes. How? Because I built the system before I built the volume. Call any wholesale account I have. He called 3 of them. He called back the following week and said they would like to start in September. Backing, I'll need a signed purchase order and 30% down. That's not standard. It is for me. 3 months later, there were 42 locked glass cases in 3 states, holding 240 belts a year between them, roughly 1 belt per store every 2 months, and every one of them was made out of something a tannery had once paid to bury. Revenue crossed $500,000 in 2017 at an average selling price of $240. He had squeezed everything there was to squeeze out of 900 belts. To go further, he was going to have to do the one thing he had never done in 9 years. He was going to have to pay for the leather. Dale Crowley retired in early 2018. Before he went, he sat down with Elias and told him the scrap arrangement had saved the tannery roughly $72,000 in disposal fees over its life. I want you to know we got something out of it too. I know. That's why it lasted. Then Crowley told him the new management would want to renegotiate. I know that too. Here is what Elias found when he opened the books, which the right of first refusal he had signed at 20 entitled him to ask for. 2 things, and the first one nearly stopped his heart. The Stafford County Leather Works was losing money, 4,000 hides a year, 47 people, and a margin that had quietly disappeared. New management was pricing out a closure. If the tannery closed, there was no leather. If there was no leather, there was no Boone Tool Works. Everything he had built stood on top of a building that smelled bad and that nobody in the county wanted to think about. And the second thing was this. For 9 years, he had been receiving 300 pounds every 6 to 8 weeks, and for 9 years he had assumed that was all there was. It was not all there was. It was what fit on a truck run Crowley was already making, roughly a quarter of the qualifying offcut. The rest, thousands of pounds a year of the best material in America, had been going into the ground in Reno County the entire time, at $8,000 a year, while a man 40 miles away rationed himself to 900 belts and called it a ceiling. So he did not negotiate to keep the leather free. He walked in and offered to pay for it. All of it. A 5-year contract, a fixed price on every offcut above his thickness threshold, a volume commitment, quarterly, in advance. New management looked at him like he had lost his mind. He was offering money for the thing they were currently paying to destroy. He wrote one line in the notebook that night, and it is the answer to the question this whole thing started with. The leather was never free. Somebody was paying to feed it for 9 years. They just called it a landfill fee. Now I call it what it is. Raw material. March of 2018. 9 years almost to the day from a Tuesday morning in March. The truck still comes, every 6 to 8 weeks. It comes heavier now and more often, and the only real difference is that it is a delivery instead of a dump. And the driver knocks. Supply went from 900 belts to 3,500. Revenue crossed $800,000 in 2018. In 2019, the year he turned 28, Boone Tool Works passed $1 million at an average selling price of $285. He wrote the number in the notebook and underlined it once and went to make supper. Otis Boone died in January of 2020 at 81 of a heart failure that came with almost no warning and ended quietly in the house where he had been born, the house his people built with their own hands, on ground his grandson had bought back with money made out of garbage. The term loan had been paid off the previous spring. Elias had the canceled note in the drawer with the photographs. Otis left the remaining 157 acres to his son. Elias's father had spent 30 years at a plant in Wichita and had never wanted to farm a day in his life. And he did not sell 1 acre of it. He leased the wheat ground to a neighbor and put the deed in the family's name and left it there. The ground stayed Boone ground. It was the only thing Otis had ever asked of it. At the funeral, the pastor said Otis Boone had been a man who trusted what he could see and what he could measure. Elias sat in the front pew between his father and his sister and thought that was exactly right, and that he had learned it from him. On the living room wall, next to the photograph of Ezra Boone from 1878, hung a materials science degree from Kansas State, dated 2016. Otis had framed it himself and hung it there without telling anybody. Gene Sievert carried Boone Tool Works at the Agra Valley Co-op from 2015 on. 9 belts a month on average, because by then they cost $340 and lived in a locked case behind the counter, and he had to fetch the key every time somebody asked. And over the years, he developed a speech. He gave it to every customer who picked one up, looked at the price, and set it back down. It explained the grain layer and the split layer. It explained the saddle stitch and the waxed linen thread. It explained longevity. And it closed with the arithmetic of what a man actually spends over 10 years. It was, in substance, the argument an 18-year-old had made to him across that same counter in April of 2010, about 4 seconds before he laughed. He gave it without attribution. Elias never asked him to do otherwise. There is one detail Elias knew and never mentioned to anybody. Gene Sievert wore a Boone belt, serial number 0311. He paid full retail. He never asked for a discount. The Tulsa contract ran its 5 years, and Elias did not renew it in 2022. By then, the waiting list was longer than the chain's annual allocation, and a company that publishes its own ceiling eventually has to choose who gets under it, which left in 2023 14 employees and 9 authorized dealers. 9, not 42. Because fewer doors is what the top of a market looks like. Direct sales were 61% of revenue. The average belt sold for $340, and the flagship, the one they called the number 1, sold for $495. The waiting list ran 14 weeks. Material cost was $41 to $48 a belt now, better than double what it had been, because it included leather. Gross margin was still above 60%. Output was about 3,000 belts a year, against a supply that would have allowed 3,500, and the difference was a decision, not a limit. Every one of those 14 people had been trained on the saddle stitch, the grading system, and a set of quality standards that a 17-year-old pulled out of 11 days, a borrowed awl, and one piece of leather the entire county had agreed was trash. Ray Petrosky was 68 and did not stitch anymore. His hands were done with it. He came in 3 days a week to train new hires, and he told every one of them the same thing on the first morning, that the difference between a good tool and a bad tool is not price. It is design. Now let me tell you one last thing. In the spring of 2023, Naomi Boone came home for spring break. She was 20. A sophomore at Kansas State studying environmental science, and she sat down at the same kitchen table where her brother had once sat with a piece of tannery scrap and their grandfather's awl. She had a folder with her. She opened it. I want to talk to you about vegetable tanning. The tannery ran chrome, she told him, which was industry standard, but the market for vegetable tanned leather was 3 times the size of the premium work gear market, and nobody in the region produced it at scale. If the tannery could be persuaded to run one vegetable line, and if Boone had first access to the offcuts, there was a second product line waiting in heritage goods, and the overlap with the existing customers would be substantial. She had data. She had market research. She had a professor at Kansas State who had connected her with a tannery in Vermont that had made the transition and would consult. She had a notebook. And she had the particular expression of somebody who has done the work and knows it and is waiting to find out whether the person across the table understands that. Elias Boone looked at the folder, and for about 10 seconds he was sitting in Gene Sievert's chair, because this was that exact moment. A kid, a stack of paper, an idea that every comprehensive theory of what works says will not work. And an adult with every legitimate reason on earth, capacity full, 14 weeks of backlog, a 5-year contract, 14 people depending on a proven process, to say, "This is a nice hobby. I mean that. I'm glad you've got something to do." He thought about March of 2009 and a truck driving away and a pile of scraps settling into the gravel. He thought about the laugh. He thought about the word son. He thought about the awl in his grandfather's barn. He thought about a teacher standing in front of a classroom in St. John saying that the most undervalued resource in American agriculture is not land, not water, not labor, but waste. He thought about all of it for about 10 seconds. "Show me the numbers." Naomi turned to the second page. Outside, the county road ran flat and straight toward the horizon the way it always had. The shed stood where the old shed had stood. On 3 acres, a boy bought back from his own grandfather with a notarized contract at 4%, because he understood that some men would rather lose everything than accept a gift. And the Tannery truck still came every 6 to 8 weeks. Now it invoiced, and somewhere in the old barn there was still a first-generation Boone belt. The one with the stitching running uneven in 2 places, and the pocket sitting a 1/4 inch too low, hanging on a nail Ray Petrosky drove into the wall years ago and never took out. It has no serial number. It has never been in a locked case. Nobody ever paid $495 for it. It is the kind of thing you keep not because it is perfect, but because it is proof that you started. Because it is the answer to the question of whether the distance between the thought and the action is too wide to cross. It isn't. They dumped garbage in a black boy's barn for 9 years and called it kindness. They laughed. The drought came. The bank said no. The wheat died. The belts lived. The tannery still delivers, and now he is the one paying, because if he doesn't, it closes, and 47 people lose their jobs in the county that told him he had a nice little something to do. The notebook keeps filling. And the boy who stood at a kitchen window at 17, watching a truck drive away, built something that will outlast the truck, the tannery, and every ceiling anybody in Stafford County ever thought to name. Closing, 340 words. Before you go, sit with one thing. That truck went to 4 farms, same leather, same price, which was nothing. 3 of those piles went gray in the weather behind 3 barns owned by men who were older, better funded, and better connected than a 17-year-old with a borrowed awl. So the advantage was never the leather. It was 2 hours on his knees in the gravel, sorting something everybody else had already agreed was trash. And here is what that story actually leaves you with if you take it seriously. The first one is this. He did not find an opportunity. He found an inconvenience, and everybody else had already walked past it. That is what an opportunity looks like before somebody does the work. It looks like a mess nobody wants to touch. The second one is the notebook. A man laughed at him and he wrote down the laugh word for word with a date beside it. That is the whole trick. You cannot use an insult. You can use a sentence with a date on it. The third one is the hardest. For 9 years he had a ceiling of 900 belts, and he believed it was real, because he had never once asked what else was on that truck. The ceiling was not in the leather. It was in the question he had not thought to ask yet. Most of us have one of those. So, what is sitting in your gravel? Not a metaphor, an actual thing. The skill nobody in your life takes seriously. The waste stream at your job that everybody complains about and nobody has costed out. The inconvenience you have walked past 400 times because it did not look like anything. You already know what it is. You thought of it somewhere around the second act. The only question left is the one this whole story was really about. Whether the distance between the thought and the action is too wide to cross. It isn't. Go get the all.